Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's EACC webinar, Expanding Operations into New Territories, Has a Recipe for Success Changed in a Post-COVID World? This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce and our network of chapters across the United States and Europe. The EACC is where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. My name is Christina Slizinska. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC chapter in Florida and lead organizer for this program. Before we start, let me review some of the elements of the GoToWebinar platform we're using today. The main one you will find on the interface or control panel in the upper right-hand side of your screen is a function called Questions, which you should be using at any time to join the discussion. We have a great number of registrants from both sides of the Atlantic and beyond. Some of you asked questions or offered comments when you registered, and we pass them on to the panel. And don't hesitate to ask more. So one disclaimer for this program, note that all comments and opinions presented by our speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the EACC or of its members. And one final note, we're recording this presentation and it will be posted to our YouTube channel in the future. So, we are slowly emerging from this global pandemic, which is not quite over yet, and many questions have arisen. And one of them have to do with operations into another country. If I want to expand, what do I need to know? Has the recipe for success changed? We have a wonderful cast of panelists who will offer their views and perhaps some of the ingredients of the recipe. Juan Botín is project director at Grupo Santander. He has been with Grupo Santander for over 30 years across several divisions and geographies, and he joins us from Madrid. Jan Willem van Drimmelen has 20 years of experience in senior commercial and leadership roles in the professional services business. He is Chief Commercial Officer and Head of North America at TMF Group, based in Amsterdam, and joins us from Amsterdam. Eduardo Gambarro is a partner at the Greenberg Traurig global law firm and focuses his practice on Italian and European antitrust law. Eduardo joins us from Milano. Tyler Lavin has 17 years of experience in the hospitality and real estate industries. He handles development and investment for North America for Citizen M Hotels, a Dutch brand, and he joins us from New York. And Mike Maroney has over 15 years experience of working with global services companies in Europe and the United States. He is head of global client directors and North America head of business development, also at TMF Group. And he joins us from Miami. And Mike will be our moderator for the day. And now, without further ado, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina, for the kind introduction, and also thank you to the EACC Florida for hosting us all today. It's a really great session that I think we have in front of us, and I'm super excited for the diverse panel we have. I'm a bit of a dork when it comes to geography, and I think it's pretty cool that we've got people on this call in a relatively small group, sitting in 4 countries around the world, sitting in about 5 different cities that are all kind of key cities when it comes to expansion. And also, when you look at actually the companies that are represented, we see a presence in well over 100 countries around the world combined on this call. So you have a lot of experience here. Feel free to fire away your questions, as Christina suggested, in the chat function. I'm sure we can answer many of them. If it gets to something specific, like the specific tax treatment in Alabama, or how things work in terms of incorporating in Albania, we might need to get back to you. But overall, I think you'll feel some pretty strong responses in terms of being able to give you some great information on this webinar and in the Q&A after. So as the 5 of us discuss kind of what's the best topic to cover today in terms of that would help companies who are looking at their operations post-COVID, we all saw that within our companies, but also within our clients, that there is a keen interest on how to expand their businesses. Much of that is looking at potentially new countries to enter in order to achieve that. Personally, I've seen companies expanding for a number of reasons in the last 6 months. Some are trying to take advantage of kind of a post-COVID world and looking at, where can they expand their operations. They may have a specific area that is growing post-COVID. I have one company that's entering into 20 new markets in the next 6 months, right? Others are really looking at, okay, this might be our first entry into an international market, looking to expand beyond where they are. And what does that mean for the business? How do they do it well? Others are part of M&A, so looking at an acquisition, and that acquisition might take them into new countries that they now need to figure out how do they act responsibly and make sure that they're delivering against their business targets. And lastly, in COVID, we've seen a lot of employees who are looking for new places to work in terms of location, right? They've been working from home and maybe they moved themselves from England to France or moved themselves from the US to Mexico. And as employers look at, how are we going to enable that to happen, they're having to look at things like, does that create substance? And does that require some type of registration or incorporation? From my perspective, this is fantastic to see, right? I think this type of activity is showing that the world has, been able to sustain kind of the blow that was given to us from COVID and is really coming out the other side of it. What's interesting though, is that countries and regulators haven't been at a standstill during this time. They haven't been just sitting there waiting for COVID to end. So, the trends, some of which we saw before and some of which are new, are really impacting companies that are looking to expand. Besides normal developments, there's been over 1,300 government programs that are looking to support companies and employees during COVID. So, of course, this was fantastic to support people during COVID. But what it's also meant is these governments are now looking at, how do we pay for those programs, right? We spent a lot of money and will continue to do so. And so they're now looking at, the programs they already had in place in terms of regulations, and have they enforced them enough? Will they enforce them more? And they're also looking at, new considerations in terms of things that will generate revenue from them from a tax perspective, and making sure that they're getting their share of taxable revenue. So these are all, quite interesting trends. And, I think, from our perspective today, what we're going to focus on is this increased oversight from both a global but also local corporate governance perspective, and also looking at other areas of focus like employee protection, new EU initiatives that are at the doorsteps for companies to be prepared for. And there's really two key areas that we want to focus on. Number one is a trend towards more responsible governance that's expected of companies as they enter into and operate in new countries, or the countries that they already exist in. And the other is the complexity of balancing the sometimes similar but often conflicting impact of global versus local regulations. Now, for number one, I'd like to dive right in, because that's the first subject that we'll discuss today with our panelists. We've seen in the last few years an expectation of companies entering new markets that they take a more responsible approach to their foreign operations, in terms of having a local presence, being a responsible employer, having certain mandates to keep their books locally, for example, or compliance requirements themselves, becoming stricter and having higher penalties, not just for companies, but also their employees, especially if those employees act as a local director. It's hugely important for companies to consider these things as they enter into new markets, because it could make the make or break difference between whether they're successful against their business plans. And if they do well, it means that they can have a great market entry as well as great expansion. If they don't, it could mean things as extreme as their license to operate being taken away, or fines that hit them that actually impact the bottom line that they were planning on. Of course, on the other side of things, on the less extreme, it just can be an impact on reputational risk as well as the attractiveness of employees. And to go into this subject, I want to start with you, Jan Willem. As TMF is looking at their clients or TMF themselves expanding, what are you seeing as the trends companies need to consider as part of their expansion strategies around the world?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for asking me that question. And thanks, Christina, for having us here today. Really excited to be on this webinar. Well, first and foremost, I think one of the overarching themes that we are observing is the overwhelming resilience of the U.S. economy, right? So if you look at the money supply, the capital that's out there that needs to be invested by companies and investors in general, is sparking a huge level of new activity and innovation also, actually. So we're seeing a lot of clients and also some new client segments emerging, whether that's on the technology side or the biopharma and health tech side of the spectrum, that are now starting to really ramp up their overseas growth plans and started to expand into new territories. So those are very, very interesting developments for us. And in terms of the key trends and sort of opportunities that these companies are trying to capture, I think what's really interesting in terms of the territories is to see the demand for opportunities in Latin America and Southeast Asia. I think that if I look at the overall sort of spectrum, and that's the beauty, of course, of our role at TMF, that we really help our clients expand into multiple territories, and we clearly see a lot of interest for investments into Latin America and Southeast Asia. Now, with that, of course, comes complexity. And I have to say that, my 20 years in this business, the level of complexity is certainly not getting less. I think some countries are making, good progress in terms of, becoming more business friendly when it comes to welcoming foreign investors, to set up entities, to hire employees, et cetera, et cetera. There's still a huge level of bureaucracy and complexity in many markets around the world. Now, on top of that, what we're seeing is that in some of those economies where we're unfortunately still dealing with the pandemic, as opposed to the US and some countries in Western Europe where most of the population, adult population, have now been vaccinated. Other countries where that's not the case, unfortunately, sadly, we're dealing with a lot of unfortunate delays in terms of processes, local authorities, service providers, etc., that are struggling to keep up with the demand. So one thing that, of course, most of our clients are doing, they're looking for local partners as well. It's very important that when you expand into these regions, you find a partner on the ground, and it starts also with the war on talent. It's another trend that we're seeing. I mean, because of the uptick in economic activity, inflation is up in many places around the world. The resurgence of consumer confidence. There's also a war on talent. I think many job markets, and yours in Miami, of course, Mike, is one of those cities or regions where you're coming out of the pandemic stronger. You have been attracting a lot of businesses, and that applies to many parts of the world where you see it's becoming more difficult to find talent, particularly if you're a foreign investor without any local brand recognition or network on the ground. So that's another thing that our clients are dealing with, and you can solve for by using local partners to help you with that. So all in all, quite excited about what we're seeing in terms of international expansion. The complexity is not getting less, which is a challenge for our clients. Obviously, we're there to help them with that, but it is definitely a trend that we're seeing. So back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Manuel. I mean, really interesting, right? And I think it's the complexities don't just exist in one place around the world, right? They're all over, and certainly growing. So, thank you for that. And Juan, from a Santander perspective, and the banking world obviously has gotten definitely more complex over the years. From a compliance requirements for entering and operating financially in foreign countries, how have you seen those evolve, and is there new complexities for companies as they consider that side of what they need to do to operate in a new country?
Well, thanks, Christine, for inviting me. Thanks, Mike, for the question. Obviously, the simple question is obviously that today we have more complexity. Let's to give you some background. I would say that the global financial crisis in 2008, that is starting from the regulatory starting asking for new requirement. So this is let's say when the process is starting be more complex. In the particular case of Santander, we have a big international presence. What we have done in this process is that we have tried to create some corporate umbrella to try to cover as much as we can in many markets, but I agree with Jan's comment that the complexity is going up. And one thing that we are trying to see, and I say again in connection with Jan's comment, is is try to find local partners. So what we are trying to do is try to connect our customers that we have in our bank, because sometimes that could be one easy way of developing relation. If we have a well-established company in Brazil, a company established, let's say US, so why we don't try to put them together and to see how they can talk each other. So this is the first question. The second question, it is just about what you have mentioned is the challenge that we have regarding the onboarding in a post-COVID digital age. Obviously, the way organizations operate have changed dramatically since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, with remote working becoming the new normal, a process that was expected to take years to implement was adopted in a matter of days. So how organizations successfully adapt can we see an onboarding procedure to respond to the challenging market environment in the post-COVID digital? I think is a critical point that we have seen. And the last comment that we want to mention is companies now in this moment are looking to expand their business into new markets and just for a question of revenue growth and diversification, because obviously the pandemic has collapsed many things. And it's important to be sure that they take in considerations many aspects that probably we can cover a little bit later. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Ron. Really interesting, and I think from our experience as well, it's such a key subject, right? And unfortunately, if people do wait too long to think about what their banking is going to look like and how they're going to manage that, it often can delay their entry. So really important. Thank you for that, Eduardo. I think we have many companies who are potentially looking at Europe as a point of expansion, or already in Europe and looking at other countries, and for them, I think what key developments are you seeing, such as the current or upcoming EU initiatives that they should bear in mind?
Thanks, Mike, for the question, and thanks, Christina, for the invitation, which I'm honored. It's a good question because it's one of the many complexities on the table. Non-EU companies wishing to invest in the European Union now are currently subject to several regulatory hurdles. One of the hurdles, it's a traditional one, is merger control, either at EU or national level, if the relevant thresholds, which usually are turnover thresholds, are met. It's important to recall that mergers that are notified at the EU level, according to the one-stop shop principle, so before the European Commission, are not subject to filing obligations at national level. A second regulatory constraint is FDI control, so foreign direct investment, both again at national and EU level. The EU framework for FDI have become operational as of October 2020, and this mechanism covers foreign investments which threaten security and public order within the EU, and might apply both to greenfield operations and investments or M&A transactions. The fact is that this mechanism coexists with those implemented at national level, so the so-called golden power regimes. And what is very interesting, we really noticed that during the COVID, either the new regimes have been introduced at national level, or the existing ones were strengthened. So now we have at least 18 member state golden power regimes. I take as an example the Italian one, on which I'm probably most familiar. Under such regime, which has been strengthened, the Italian government is empowered to prohibit or to impose conditions on transactions involving the acquisition of critical assets in sectors like defense, energy, transport, but also telecommunication, insurance, healthcare. So basically, very wide array. And a further regulatory obstacle is it comes from the treaty, It's Article 107 and following of the treaty, which prohibit public support, this time by EU member states. So it's the so-called state aid regime, which is a peculiarity of the European Union, but I'm sure that US audience is becoming familiar to state aid after the new approach of the European Commission in the last 4 or 5 years. But probably the most interesting development, which is still a potential development, is the proposed regulation by the European Commission, which was drafted on May the 5th this year, to tackle foreign subsidies causing distortions in the European Union's internal market. If this regulation will be adopted, the European Commission will be empowered to review subsidies granted by non-EU countries, which may cause distortions in the internal market and undermine the level playing field within the EU, especially those subsidies which are used either to finance participation in public procurement tenders or acquisition of undertakings. So basically, the European Commission proposed a three-tiered investigative tool, two notification-based tools, one for bids in public procurement, another one for concentrations if specific turnover thresholds are met. But it will introduce also a general ex officio, let's say, power for the Commission to review any market situation. So potentially it's a very wide powers. The Commission might have also the power to launch market inquiries and to impose redressive measures to remedy those distortions in a similar way to the measures currently imposed under antitrust or merger control rules. So that's it for the moment, but just to introduce the issue.
Thanks, Eduardo. Really interesting, right? And I think exactly as we discussed in the beginning, right? The EU and local governments didn't sit still during COVID. I'm sure they were doing Zoom meetings and everything like the rest of us as they looked at implementing new positions and potential future regulations. So thank you for that. Super interesting. Tyler, I think Juan mentioned in his session about connecting companies together and clients. I think it's great to have you on today to talk about what SysNem has seen in the hotel industry, which obviously over the last year and a half has been one of the key industries that's been impacted. As a result of the last couple of years, but also overall, has there been a change in the ways that you approach entering new markets and the demands as a business from local governments and even employees that you're seeing?
Yeah, and thank you again, Christina, for including me on this panel. This is really humbling to be part of. I think it's helpful to give just a little background on SysNem. We are a Dutch company. Our main shareholder is the Dutch Workers' Pension Fund, represented by APG. We are a vertically integrated real estate company, so it's a much different hotel company than you traditionally see. We build our hotels and own them and then operate them, where a lot of times you see companies that will just brand, franchise, etc. So for better or worse, we understand the challenges from the very beginning of a development project through trying to open and operate these hotels. Our first one opened in North America in 2014 in Times Square. That was done completely out of Voorschoten. And I think that, Mike will ask me later about some of the challenges of importing culture and your company overseas. I think they realized with that one that you needed to have a local presence. Fast forward to today, we've got 5 hotels open in North America. We're going to open another 6 towards the end of the year and the beginning of next year. So kind of our hockey stick moment here in North America. 2 in Miami. And that sort of brings me to the challenges that we're facing today. I think actually I read a great article in the Miami Herald the other day that I think gives some good perspective. It was about a chef who had worked 2 different jobs, at a Hilton and then a Marriott, and he was, getting up at 5 in the morning, working 2 8-hour shifts, sleeping and doing that 6 days a week, pre-COVID. Post-COVID, after sitting at home and realizing his self-worth and that is no way to live his life, he now has a job for one hotel at call it 25 to 30% higher pay, more benefits offered. And he's not going to work 2 jobs anymore. And I think, Jan Willem kind of touched on it. There's a human capital challenge that we're facing now that is not just competition for people, but competition across industries where people, no longer will work crazy hours because they realize that the quality of life that they can achieve without doing that is there. And hospitality is very challenged because we are not necessarily, the highest paid industry. So it's a unique challenge for us. And I think that what you're going to see is, more benefits offered. There's obviously going to be retention bonuses and referral bonuses and signing bonuses at even like the most basic entry level positions in hospitality, just to get people in the door. I think you're also going to see a lot more reliance on third parties to do different aspects of the operations, whether it's, trying to limit your food and beverage exposure and having vendors bring that in, or, what Citizen M does, we work with actually a Dutch company that we outsource all our housekeeping. And so, for us, a challenge is always going to be whether they have the capability of working with us in that market, because we do not want to start our own, housekeeping operation. And that brings me to another challenge that, we're sort of facing as we kind of grow into North America. North America, or America, is unique in the sense that you can have a state that is very red, from a regulatory standpoint, low income taxes to no income taxes, very, very business friendly, but the cities inside those states sometimes are blue. So we call these purple cities, Miami being probably one of them. So you're facing almost your own city-state regulation as you go into each of these cities. And if there's, for instance, in a city, a heavy union influence, you're looking at hotels right now that are struggling to staff up. And one way to sort of mitigate it is through the use of technology, or, things like maybe you won't get your room cleaned if it's a stayover. Those sort of, things that people don't really pay for and you're giving away, but you don't have the staffing to do it anymore. But unions influencing the city governments to say they can't do this. This is taking away jobs. This is taking away, wages from our employees. And that's there's no real good answer there, because the demand for it and the ability to provide it is no longer there. But you're fighting sort of regulation that forces you to do it anyway to avoid either lawsuits or becoming unionized if you do not meet the same standards that the rest of the city is providing. So for us, it's we're very careful now about where we go, how we are going to work with third parties when we're trying to open and operate a hotel. That's just the operating side. Obviously, going into each city is also a large challenge from the construction standpoint today, where we're facing a shortage of labor on construction, and that is, Miami being a great example. It's driving up prices. Everyone's talking about the commodities and steel and lumber, et cetera. But the human side is going to be the one that's here to stay. I think that those eventually will sort of even out over time as the supply pipeline sort of levels out. But the cost to construct from a human capital side are not going to go down. So, I think that inflation is here. You're seeing it in the wages, you're seeing it in construction. I think commodity prices will even out, but the labor side, I don't see evening out. So adoption of technology across the board. For us, we do a lot more. We call it BIM technology, where we're actually designing the hotel digitally and trying to eliminate change order errors and human, capital errors early on in a process. And that's just technology from the construction side right through. Now every hotel company has an app that allows you to opt in and out of services. Your ability to kind of bypass the front desk is real. So, trying to limit your front of house FTE count, all of those things were slow moving in hospitality, and in the last year and a half have been adopted overnight, and the technology is there. And now people are just you're deciding whether to make the the CapEx decision to pay for it now or pay for it later. But I could probably talk for an hour about the challenges we're facing on this side of things.
Thanks. That's super interesting, and right. And I think, like you said, I live in, work in Miami and live in Fort Lauderdale, just north, and you see it firsthand what people in the services industry are facing. I mean, if I talk to a waiter at a restaurant, they'll tell me every 2 weeks somebody comes in, sits at their table, and instead of giving them a nice tip, offers them a job in another restaurant by the by the end of the session. So I think it's real, right? And we're not just seeing that in the services, right? I think there's a high demand for good employees across the board. I think that was really interesting and quite a complex topic. We covered, I think really well. So thank you to the panelists for that question. I'm gonna move on to our second topic of the day. So what we really want to look at in this topic is what are the trends that we're seeing in the international versus the local regulatory environment, and that complexity that it causes. So we're going to look at things like the meeting the global obligations like CRS, UBO, FATCA, but also managing those requirements versus the local ones that you might see, and impacts of the global ones like the OECD's Common Reporting Standard, managing that versus local complexities. Also looking at how to manage the domination of local legislation in certain business areas, so such as incorporations, which can be very local and how they operate, and not just incorporations, but actually setting up to be operational. Also, accounting is another area that is you have global standards, but you also have some very local standards, and also tied to what Tyler already started covering, looking at what the complexities that causes in assembling a workforce. So Eduardo, I'm going to kick off with you. I mean, you mentioned, in your earlier answer about kind of changes in Europe, and looking at the European Commission's proposal for regulating foreign subsidies control in the first subject. Could you expand on this a bit? Because I think it is quite an interesting topic, and something that a lot of companies will need help getting their head around as they're looking at the opportunities and the risk as they enter into Europe.
Yes, you're right. I think it's a potentially very ambitious regulation, which, as I said, is not yet in force, but have to be. So it might also be slightly modified, but it has to be enacted by the Parliament and the Council through the ordinary legislative procedure. Of course, if it comes into force, it would have a material impact on those non-EU companies that wish to invest in the EU internal market. So first problem, needless to say, a new regulatory obstacle would be added to those already existing. And so a first comment is that companies involved, for example, in M&A transactions might have to simultaneously deal with multiple review procedures, and the interplay between the new regime and the existing procedures remains unclear. Just to make a couple of examples, let's think about the interplay and the overlaps between this new regulation and merger control. Will the form and the notification be dealt with by the same case team at the European Commission? Will companies need to use the same form or two separate forms? I think that guidance from the Commission will be required in case of adoption of the proposal. But I think that the Commission will need also to clarify some other aspects more substantial, because, for example, the relevant criteria to evaluate whether a subsidy is liable to distort competition within an internal market probably needs to be better clarified. You asked me about the impact. I think that the need to deal with multiple regulatory framework, possibly pending before different regulators, EU and national ones, will likely cause delays in the completion of transactions, and probably also non-EU companies will likely incur also in additional transaction costs. In theory, but probably it's just a risk in principle, the adoption of such regulation might induce some EU sellers to prefer EU companies over non-EU investors to avoid the risk of a deal being prohibited or suspended or subject to conditions, or even simply delayed. Okay. What are the companies that need to be more careful? Those that received in the 3 years prior to the notification of a transaction a substantial funding from countries external to the EU, of more than 50 million euro. Only such companies will be subject to the notification obligation, assuming that the other threshold is met. It's important to note that the notion of financial contribution is very broad, so it encompasses not only transfer of funds or liabilities in any form, but also the foregoing of revenue that would otherwise have been due, such as tax exemptions or deduction. At the same time, it's very broad the origin of the fund. So it might be just a fund given by the central government or by the government or by a governmental authority, but also granted by public or private entities that are directly or indirectly attributable to the state. I think that is particularly interesting, the impact on public procurement procedures. The proposal concerns only public procurement procedures having an estimated value of more than 250 million euro, and therefore smaller procedures fall outside the scope of the screening mechanism. What are the likely impact on public procurement? I think that the need to review bids made by non-EU companies will increase the duration of the procedures, just because there is the need to wait for the outcome of the Commission's review. And again, it cannot be ruled out that contracting authorities will prefer EU companies over non-EU ones in order to avoid delays. What is quite worrying is the fact that, as I mentioned before, the Commission reserved itself a sort of ex officio power to investigate any distortive foreign subsidies, including concentrations and public procurements falling below the relevant threshold. Hopefully, the Commission would limit the use of said investigation powers to very, very exceptional cases of highly distortive subsidies, because otherwise, I think that would be a risk of impact on legal certainty. I think, therefore, that the state-backed companies need to review financial contributions that receive from non-EU governments, and especially those that the Commission might deem most likely to distort the internal market. So, for example, public support to ailing undertakings in the absence of a restructuring plan, unlimited guarantees, or subsidies directly aimed at supporting an M&A transaction or a participation to a tender. I think these are the probably most apparent impacts on business.
Thanks, Eduardo, and a great job, summarizing quite a complex situation in a short area. So certainly, I'm sure anybody who's looking for help in that would need legal advice, which I'm sure you're happy to take questions on at a different stage. But thank you for that. And Tyler, in your experience, I mean, especially as being the EICC here, we're looking at obviously European companies coming into the U.S. as well, which you're focused on. When you're looking at new markets, how are you evaluating and balancing the kind of international policies or your policies as a company versus the local regulations or nuances to the market, kind of what you talked about in Miami? I think it'd be really interesting to the audience to hear about that.
I'll cover this like in a two-pronged, answer. So I think when the European company, for instance, us, Sysnem, coming out of Netherlands, moved to the United States, there was some lack of awareness of the difference between operating in Netherlands versus operating in the United States, and mostly on the labor front. Regulation you can figure out, but what the web of government services that the Netherlands offers and kind of the social fallback is not really offered here in the United States. So there tends to be a much more competitive turnover environment here in the United States that the Dutch were not necessarily used to, both at the hotel level and at the corporate headquarters. So I'll give you we were a bit of a trial and error. They tried to hire a local team without anyone from the mothership really joining the New York office, and that team flushed out in the first year. I'm part of the second team, and they decided to bring a few core people who they were, call it middle management, that had aspirations for, being a global leader within the company, who they knew would be very loyal and kind of help import the culture from the Netherlands to kind of reestablish that base employee. And we've built off of that. I joined 5 years ago, and I think that, the second time around where they really were able to bring some people over from Voorschoten to live here and establish the US presence that way is a much better approach than trying to hire locally. Then, from a development and operating perspective, there's so many things that you can get tripped up on when working with cities, trying to go through a zoning process. There's a lot of issues with inclusionary housing in these cities these days. So, dealing with how to sort of work with cities on giving them the things that they want. In the code, the books are six inches thick. So we a lot of times will try and pick a local development partner that knows the city officials, knows the city government, and we're almost like importing our culture to these cities through local partners, which we would have never ever thought about 5 years ago. But just the amount of regulation that is local really forces us to try and pick partnerships that maybe cost us $1 million up front, but save us 5 million on the back end. It's the same reason we work with people like Greenberg Traurig, because they've got a global presence. We know that our relationship partner is going to get us the best team in the local city because they have those established presence. Greenberg Traurig in Miami did all the work for our 3 hotels there, and they also did all the work for us in Boston, local teams, but then a central partner. So picking those global partnerships as we expand, where the teams locally also understand the nuances of the code and how to work the city officials, et cetera, through the development process. Those are important relationships for us. So yeah, it's tricky because hospitality is egalitarian at its core, and just as Juan had said before, you may get recruited out of your front desk position to get paid $5 more an hour to do something else. That doesn't happen as much in Europe, but in the United States, that's happening every day. So just trying to understand where the market is in terms of how do you pay people when you go into a new market to retain your talent and develop them internally versus losing them. And the cost of losing employees is so much more than it is on paper. So I think coming into a market, coming in with a core team, and really working with an HR firm on where the market is to establish the next group of employees is really important when you're trying to go from one country to another, whether you're setting up a corporate team or a local operating team.
Thanks, Tyler. It's super interesting. I think, I'm sure there might be some questions later related to it. So thank you for that. It's really, really good to hear. And then Juan, when you're working with clients at Santander and they're looking at entering new markets, how are you seeing them manage the local complexities we've talked about on the call, kind of similar to what Tyler's experienced, in the US, but obviously could be experienced in other countries as well. And has this, have you seen it change significantly?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. The first thing is that probably just to put us in context, that Santander currently has a strong presence in 12 markets, plus we have in total presence in 30 markets. So when we decide to help customers to go abroad, we need to see what we want to do. So first thing we decided to see how we can decide to do things simple, personal, and fair. So this is the way that we want to start organizing the thing. So Santander is now developing an idea what we call One Santander, and this is we are creating a common operating and business model. We have now focused mainly in Europe with our vision of giving our 148 million customers worldwide to see us in the same way. So we need to leverage our global scale and delivery, our better customer experience, building a common culture, and sharing process and technology, and using obviously the digital way. Another question that we have seen with the customer is that today the financial institutions need to cover not only banking solutions. We need probably to see and incorporated non-banking solutions. This is what they expect. So we have established and setting up some plans with our customers, and we have decided that probably the pillar first that our customers are interested is to have trusted connections. And trusted connection going on operation, that means that we need to help our customers to introduce buyers, suppliers, partners that they can trust. I think it is a crucial point of view. And one of the partners that we are using in SAN is at the Chamber of Commerce. I think that there is the Chamber of Commerce have a great connectivity worldwide, and they can give some market view. They can give insight of trend. They can help to navigate it in the new geography. The second question is the bureaucracy. I think that there is a lot of complexity in the activity that are necessary to be well covered, and starting from trade policy, starting for regulatory or just product certification, products of proof of origin. That depends of the point that we're covering. Moving to a third point that we want to do is logistic. I think this is a critical thing that we have, understanding how important is to guarantee to the customers that are looking for a new market this end-to-end solution. So these are non-banking. Just entry in the banking propositions, we can have probably two ways. One is just offering banking activities, and that depends. This is starting from the effects. They can start for working capital. They can for payments. They can do for tracking activities of doing some specific export credits, etc. So that depends. And finally, and I think this is more we are covering today, is setting up. So when we open up operations. So here we have from the idea of opening an account, but this is more complex. And here we like to introduce to local professional service overseas that can have access to these services, including have it as well incentives that they can be covered, some schemes or any way that they can help. So this is how we are managing this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Really helpful, and I think it's great to see, like you said, it's not you don't just look at it as just setting up the bank account, right? It's that all-inclusive. How do you help a company, which is really good to see. And Jan Willem, so the last question of the day from me. We'll have some from the audience coming up, but in your experience and kind of looking at the key challenges companies face with balancing this international and local regulatory complexities, any tips you'd give to the audience here for best path forward and key things to consider?
Thanks, Mike. Really enjoying the webinar so far. Great to get perspective from the legal, banking, and the entrepreneurial side of the table, and also as a Dutchman, proud to hear the success story of Citizen M, Tyler. So great to see. In terms of let's say the Google Earth perspective on this topic from my vantage point, I think across the board clients tend to underestimate this challenge. Oftentimes you're talking about entrepreneurs who have a great idea. They're really keen to grow the business and to move super fast into a new territory, set up hire people, start selling, start producing, and then they start to think about, okay, how do I actually pull this all together from a legal and a reporting and a finance perspective. So one of the key sort of recommendations that we always share with our clients and prospective clients is start early, do your due diligence, prepare for this before you enter into new territory. And what happens next is that across sort of the spectrum of client types, because we're obviously looking at corporate clients, private equity, investment firms, entrepreneurs, smaller businesses that are setting up for the first time across a different country. I think they typically all arrive at the same sort of conclusion. Outsourcing is the best solution, right? To again rely on local partners, and preferably also an end-to-end solution. And particularly when you talk about, let's say, all the reporting requirements, whether that's CRS, FATCA, or UBO register filings, or tax compliance side of things, it's very, very difficult unless you have a very, very strong central capability, your own in-house, let's say, tax department or legal team that could look after all those global entities or subsidiaries. But not every client has that sort of luxury or those resources. The clients do tend to come to the conclusion that it makes more sense to outsource this. On top of that, of course, there's a lot of technology available, technology that service providers can use and can make available to the clients, or that you can just purchase yourself to keep track of your entities, keep track of your reporting requirements. But at the end of the day, in my experience, you always need to have someone locally in the market, whether you're a US investor, investing into Italy, or whether you're an entrepreneur from Spain investing into Brazil. You always want to rely on somebody on the ground you can actually talk to. They can oversee matters that you can trust to arrange things locally. And I think that's also to Tyler's point. Most of our clients, they do rely on, let's say, expatriate employees that they bring over from the mothership to at least train their local employees and at least be there when it comes to the setup of the team, and also inject sort of the corporate culture into the business locally, and set up reporting procedures and whatnot. So that's what we're seeing. There's obviously also hybrid models. Clients that say, well, let's take certain matters in-house. We hire one person, two people to look after reporting globally, but then for the last mile, sort of the truly local for local requirements in Brazil or in the Philippines or in India, will rely on a partner on the ground. The flip side of the coin is that if you don't get this right, penalties for non-compliance can be quite punitive, quite high in most jurisdictions, and certain outlier jurisdictions where you could really get into serious problems if you're late with a certain filing. Others may be more flexible, but in general, our clients, they obviously want to stay compliant. That's also our primary role for our clients, to make sure that they can operate safely around the world. But that's also a trend that we're seeing, that governments, and to your point, Mike, earlier, most of these governments have been printing a lot of money over the past year and a half, and now they're looking for ways to get it back, basically, and expand the tax base, expand their revenues. So I expect them to become even more strict when it comes to enforcing these reporting requirements and collecting taxes, basically.
Great, thank you, Jan Willem. I think some really helpful insights for the audience here, and thank you to all of our panelists, for a really informative session. We're going to wrap up now and move on to wrap up from Christina as well and questions. But I think from my side, I just think there's been some great tips here. And what's interesting, I think we've covered things from business strategy and business development through to HR to finance, to accounting to legal. So really a lot of areas covered in quite a short time. So I could stay here and talk for hours, but I think probably our audience would love to ask some questions as well. And so I will hand over now back to our gracious host, Christina, and again, thank you to the EACC Florida for having us today. And just a reminder to put your questions in the box. If we don't get to them all today, we'll certainly come back to you individually.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Mike. So yeah, we actually received a question, and I think this one would be for Jan Willem. So we have seen global travel restrictions due to the pandemic, which have made leisure and business travel either very complex or impossible. At the same time, immigration restrictions have been put into place, in particular in the U.S. So I know this was not really covered by the program, but still, it is part of those issues which companies need to look at. So how do you see this impacting companies looking to expand to other countries in terms of being able to send their executives to a specific location?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm glad you're asking me or directing this question to me, Christina, because I'm one of those people personally affected by this because I'm scheduled to relocate to the US from Amsterdam, but obviously waiting for certain rules to be lifted or changed depending on how you look at it. This is a concern, obviously, particularly when you look at the US. I think that it certainly hasn't become easier to relocate and migrate, employees, even for large international businesses like our firm. It's challenging. When it comes to tourism and business travel, I think that we're already seeing tourism coming back. I mean, I'm seeing it here in Amsterdam with the the level of tourism. We're the visitors to our city. It's picking up. You see more planes in the sky. Obviously, that's already picking up. On the business travel side of things, not so fast yet. I think that companies still are benefiting from the fact that working remotely and this type of technology is facilitating all. Although it's my personal view that there will be some peer pressure eventually, right? So from if one company starts to go on road shows again to meet with prospective clients or to their peers will start doing it as well, and sooner or later most of us will be back on a plane, for that meeting in Sao Paulo or that board meeting in Geneva. So it's going to happen again. It's going to come back, maybe not to the levels we were seeing prior to the pandemic, but I think it will bounce back in general. But as for the immigration restriction, it's painful. I'm confident that eventually things will improve. Also, the processing time should improve. I think some of these government institutions have also been dealing with with the pandemic and short-staffed and not able to work as efficiently as they normally would. But hopefully that will change.
Okay, thank you. So I think that it is time to wrap up, Mike. So maybe if you have a few words of conclusion.
Sure. I think just a big thank you, Christina, to yourself and EACC Florida for hosting us today. I think it was a really great session. I think hitting on a lot of topics that the EACC is passionate about, right, and helping companies who are looking at entering Europe or entering the US from Europe and vice versa, but also obviously the interests that naturally fall within that in certain other countries, especially in Latin America or otherwise. So I found this really informative. I know that we've had some good interaction from the audience, which we'll certainly follow up on. And definitely, if anybody has an individual question for any of our panelists today, I'm sure you can reach out directly, either via the ACC or find them on LinkedIn, etc. So just thank you to our panelists, thank you to our audience, and thank you to you, Christina.
So thank you, Mike. So this concludes today's webinar entitled Expanding Operations into New Territories, Has a Recipe for Success Change in a Post-COVID World. This was a very interesting conversation, which hopefully answered some of your questions, but also triggered new questions, which you can absolutely send us and have them answered by our panelists. M&A was actually mentioned a few times, and if you're interested, you can sign up to EACC's webinar tomorrow on new developments in M&A organized by EACC Paris and EACC New York. So many thanks to our panelists, Juan, Jan Willem, Eduardo, Tyler, and our moderator, Mike, for sharing some of the post-COVID ingredients for successful expansion of operations to another territory. I would also like to thank Femke Hartog, who's Director for Programs and Communications at EACC New York, who worked behind the scenes on the technical side of the webinar. And many, many thanks to the audience for joining us. So as Mike said, keep an eye for a follow-up email, and remember, EACC is a connector. If you're a member and wish to be connected to somebody who attended this program, just contact your local chapter to find out how. Check the EACC YouTube channel for a recording of this program, and check our websites for upcoming webinars and events. So thank you very much. Right now, have a lovely summer and see you all very soon. Bye-bye.
Great.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.